Thank you so much, Sarika, and thank you to all of you for staying in here and being a part of this last session of what has been a wonderful and really important conference. I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Bedegal peoples and pay tribute to our First Nations communities right across this beautiful country and their connection to the land, sea and waterways that sustain us all. We're going to pause for a moment and I'm going to set the scene. We're then going to move into a panel discussion, but we're really committed to leaving about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A with all of you. So we have a collective mission to achieve sustainable development. But our mission is looking increasingly elusive as climate chaos, growing inequality, conflict and crises, and democratic decline undo decades of human development gains. What we've been talking about a lot in the last 2 days is this global context of polycrisis, or what the ecological philosopher Joanna Macy has long predicted and called the Great Unravelling. The question is, are we as a sector fit for purpose to address these issues? The issues keeping people in poverty are structural. They're large, they're complex, and they require a response that is equal in scale and sophistication. Yet, as we all know, the aid architecture was established post-Second World War, and it was really designed as a temporary fix to temporary problems, often involving the transfer of money, of goods and NGOs, supporting projects that produce tangible outputs, schools, health clinics, etc. Fast forward some 80 years, and of course we now have tens of thousands of NGOs operating in Australia and many in Australia and around the world. And that output model is still pretty compelling, especially for the public who love the idea that $30 can save a life. But meanwhile, the world is on fire, and this is absolutely not a moment for business as usual. We also need to be thinking about systems change and how we can work across our sector, with corporates, with philanthropists, and importantly, of course, with governments to achieve it. Reforming trade rules, land and workers' rights, the arms trade, overhauling the taxation and financial system so they work for the poorest, empowering women and girls, and shaping climate policy and financing is all crucial. This work, of course, is going on around the world, and so many of the people in this room are leaders in this space, as are our panellists. But the question is, how do we take this work from the periphery to the centre? So we're dealing not just with the effects of poverty, but also its root causes. How do we better intervene upstream so we have significant downstream impacts? Or put another way, how do we shift one thing in the system so it shifts the whole system? A systems lens asks us to shift our gaze towards mission and purpose, and then do whatever it takes to achieve it, thinking less in terms of our unique value proposition and more in terms of our joint mission and how we can work together as an ecosystem to achieve it. Or put another way, if for just a moment we strip away our organisational identities and look just at our mission and the complexity of the issues undermining it and ask ourselves, what is this moment asking of us? It begs the question, what types of responses would we shape? What kind of organisations would we build, and what kind of skill sets would be required? All of our panellists have some fantastic ideas on this, so we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to start with a question for all of you, including Jane, who's joining us from Indonesia, in Jakarta. Looking back over recent decades, can you give us an example of a citizen-led movement that led to an extraordinary breakthrough for people or planet? And I might start with you, Thenu.
Thank you so much. So this image is an image I'm sure a lot of people in this room have seen. This came out of the Sri Lankan economic crisis last year in 2022, and me, along with a lot of the Sri Lankan diaspora, were glued to our TVs, glued to our screens as we were seeing what was happening in this country unfold. Now, this picture, I think, is a really visceral one. You can see the anger, the frustration, the fear in this man's eyes. You can see something basic such as bread burning be significant and almost an analogy for what was happening at the country at the time, which was that due to a number of factors such as impending economic downfall, the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing corruption, citizens were being let down. They didn't believe that their government was acting in their best interests, and a lot of people had had enough. And I think that's what this picture to me really highlights. And for me, it was a really personal, this crisis is a personal one as well. I remember being on video call with my cousins and then suddenly it cutting out because power had once again been cut out because there wasn't enough fuel. Similarly, my cousins' children couldn't go to school for a really long time, similarly because there wasn't enough fuel to get there and schools had been shut down. So I remember sitting here in Australia watching this all unfold, really just wondering what was going to happen next, because as you're all probably aware, there was no magic wand that was going to come and fix this billion-dollar debt crisis that Sri Lanka was in. But then something pretty extraordinary happened, at least in my perspective, and that was that there was a people-powered movement. And this is not something that has been super common in Sri Lanka's history. For those of you who perhaps aren't as aware, protesting is not something that has been as prominent in our culture. But what we saw is people from all different faith backgrounds, nationalities, minorities who had been campaigning against the government for years came together with newly found supporters. And there was a huge people-powered movement. Part of this was run by a few of my friends, especially in the youth movement, and we saw a huge collection of people gather at Goldface in Colombo, and there was an activist community that was being built as we saw this crisis unfold. They built a library so people could understand the historic significance of change making. They were collaborating with elders, young people, different communities, and what we saw slowly was that the community was standing up and wanting to get systems change that had not necessarily been called for in the same way. And of course, there is not necessarily one happy outcome that has resulted. This is going to be a years-long process to get Sri Lanka back to a stage where they are economically stable. But what we saw is a change in government as a first step, even though it's not perfect. And that would not have happened without that peoples-based movement. So to me, that's actually a really special moment, and one that's personal, professional, and I think one that's had a big impact on the global community too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thenu. Over to you, Gershon.
I'm going to go a bit more local in terms of the movement, but with global implications. I think this is a fantastic discussion to finish the day on, by the way. It's one of the big ones. Years ago, I used to work at Baptist World Aid. About 15 years ago, we started a campaign focused on a range of issues around modern slavery, usually around specific commodities. So we were looking at forced child labour in the West African cocoa industry. We were looking at the systematised and government-endorsed use of forced labour in the cotton industry. And those campaigns that we ran and collaborated with others to run were pretty successful in their own right. But I bring them up here because what really helped us was the way they helped build and shape a movement that was fascinated or interested in addressing this problem of modern slavery. Once we had that movement in place of people that were interested, they started to push us to do more. They recognise that modern slavery is a huge problem in the world. They recognise that the most significant way that we can impact it is through addressing the problem in Australian supply chains. So they told us to lift our eyes a bit higher. Rather than just focusing on specific issues, they were interested in trying to understand who are the people making their clothes and under what conditions were they working. We had a look around. That data wasn't easy to come by. In fact, it didn't exist despite a number of experts calling for it. Kevin Bales, the former UN Special Rapporteur on modern slavery, had been out there saying we need some sort of benchmarking so we know what companies are doing to address the problem. We decided at Baptist World Aid at the time that we would go ahead and start building those benchmarking tools for a range of industries. We found partners, so we worked with the International Labour Rights Forum in the US. We worked with a US NGO called Not for Sale that in turn had a partnership with the State Department that helped us create a benchmarking tool that was really robust. We then deployed that robust tool to start looking at the fashion industry. We chose fashion to begin with as our first industry, but a number of others followed. Fashion because it was known as an industry that had clear problems, such as forced labour in terms of cotton, but it was also super accessible. Everyone buys clothes, so we knew that it would have some interest. We spent years working on that, and it was scheduled to be launched. Our first report was scheduled to be launched in the second half of 2013. Now, some of you may remember what happened in 2013. At the beginning, in April, there was a terrible factory collapse in Bangladesh. The Rana Plaza in Dhaka collapsed, claiming with it 1,130 garment workers, many of whom were really concerned about the structural stability of the factory, but were forced back into work and died when that factory collapsed upon them. It made international headlines. All of a sudden, the questions that we were asking in this report were questions that the world was asking. Who are making my clothes and how are they being treated? For us, it was a great moment to engage companies, and our movement leveraged it. So they recognised there was so much interest in this, and they were using the research in this report, and I was hearing actually stories from this room where people were using the data in that report to go bring about direct engagement with companies to improve their practice. So our movement was using this research to praise the companies that were doing good, but also to campaign against those companies that needed to do more. Almost every single company we campaign started to take action, some more than others, but every single company moved in the right direction. And over that time, we managed to build great relationships with companies. We built in-depth knowledge of what good due diligence looks like. We had great networks and specialist expertise that we could use and help companies improve on the sticky issues in their supply chains, which all, of course, came in very handy once there was talk around building a Modern Slavery Act in Australia. We could mobilise a supporter base. We could use our input, our insights, and bring companies like Wesfarmers and Coles on board to campaign with us to say we need a robust act in Australia, which led to change.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Now over to you, Jane, in Jakarta.
Thanks, Negaya, and really great to be joining you all today. In 2012, Farisa Farhan was working in Indonesia with the Lusa Ecosystem Management Authority, a government agency that's tasked with protecting, conserving and restoring the Lusa ecosystem. For those of you who don't know, the Lusa ecosystem is a landscape that spans some 2.6 million hectares of relatively intact rainforest, and it's the last place on Earth where critically endangered wildlife, the Sumatran orangutans, rhino, tigers and elephants roam free together. And aside from its intrinsic beauty and value, it also provides clean water, clean air and protection from natural disasters. So as part of their job to protect this ecosystem, Faweza and her colleagues were working on a campaign to get law enforcement to uphold the law against a palm oil company that was burning forest. And they were gaining a lot of traction in this regard. And then suddenly the government agency that they worked for was dismantled, and they went from being the authority to being the outcast. Faweza and her colleagues loved the Lusa ecosystem too much to really stop. And so they created an organisation called HACA, which in English means Forest, Nature and Environment of Aceh. And with HACA, they aspired to strengthen grassroots organising and to engage more women in environmental work. And they gained early support from the Asia Foundation to be able to progress this. And then Faweza met Samini. Samini was a smallhold coffee farmer, and Samini and her community had lost coffee crops due to territory that had been decimated by poachers who clear-cut the forest for palm oil. And this violent destruction of the forest left the environment and the forest people exposed to really devastating floods. And so the community lost their livelihoods and their homes and had to seek shelter in a refugee camp. And then in 2017, Faweza and the HACA team partnered with Samini and her village to create a women-led ranger team to protect the forest from illegal logging. And these women became what was known as the Aceh Women Forest Defenders. And at first, other community members challenged these women, not believing that they could be effective. However, as they began to achieve success, people in these communities changed their attitudes and joined forces. And these women have now established 35 women's groups and 29 social forestry units to support sustainable forest enterprise, including tea and coffee and honey and sugar and flowers, while also tracking and reporting poachers and illegal loggers. So together they're mobilising a movement that enables women to protect local rainforests and one of the last intact ecosystems on this earth. They're also training grassroots communities to engage in forest monitoring through GPS satellite devices and drone mapping. And the women are also training men in different communities to also be strong allies and workers for forest protection. And since that time, there's been no more flooding as the forest once again becomes a protective canopy against disasters. And then speaking recently about what they've made possible, Louisa said, when women feel empowered to protect the forest, it becomes an infectious spirit for women organising everywhere.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jane. And finally, over to you, Anthea.
Thanks very much. Before I speak a little bit about my image, I would actually just like to acknowledge someone who is in the room today, because this is her story. I am inspired by this story, which is why I chose it for this. But we are actually, I hope she's in the room, Sarika's right, the lights are very bright. We are actually joined by the president of the Pacific Students Fighting Climate Change. Cynthia, if you're here, maybe you can just stand up so we can all acknowledge you. I did let her know I would do this, but maybe she's run away because I let her know that I would do this. But yes, so I just really wanted to, when we're sort of asked to think about citizen-led movements that have changed the world that we live in and have the potential for further change, this recent example was the first one that came to my mind because of the fact that it's built on decades of movement of climate activists across the Pacific and indeed across the world, but also because it showed that when networks come together, and this started with a group of law students that were studying together at the University of South Pacific, that moment that they shared together built the movement that I think many of our organisations were actually also supporting, and indeed many hundreds of organisations around the world. It also showed that a complex issue, this was essentially taking requesting an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice and all the complexities that those kinds of cases can have. It took a complex issue and had a really, really simple message. And that's what galvanised so many activists across the Pacific, across networks globally that supported this case that historically on March the 29th this year was actually requested to move through. So we've still got the whole legal process to go through in terms of the advisory opinion coming down. An opinion is just that, it will be an advisory opinion, but the opinion can actually draw on other international legal mechanisms which are actually binding in law. So while an ICJ advisory opinion is not legally binding, it can point to other legal instruments that can be legally binding. So it also has so many effects, not just for our colleagues and our friends in the Pacific, but for anyone who's actually feeling the impact of climate change, because it's essentially asking, do states have a responsibility to their citizens for the impacts of climate change? It also showed that by having a student-led movement that galvanised the hearts and the commitment and the solidarity of so many others, but also with a government that was willing to take that question through, we actually can see where that's come from, because the student body themselves couldn't get that through. They had to have a government who was willing to put the request through. So it's really important as well to sort of say, when you've got a simple message, when you've got literally lives that are at risk, and you've got people who are willing to stand up for their communities, and you've got others who are acting in solidarity and allyship, and you've got a government who is understanding, because it is their people that are facing these impacts, that can take that request straight through, and that historic moment I think that we all remember so well in March. But the moment for us doesn't stop there. I guess that's why I also chose this, similar to what Thanu was saying in terms of the implications of that moment in Sri Lanka, the implications of having a Modern Slavery Act. It doesn't stop. standing in solidarity, having citizen-led movements, having the review of our systems is actually how these moments that inspire movements also have movements that need moments. And I think, to me, all of our examples actually are really linked to that. I can't claim that quote, that came from someone else, so don't credit that to me, but it's something that I've heard in the last couple of weeks that has really, really gelled with me, and I think is really part of the panel that we're on today.
Beautiful, thank you so much. I mean, this work is so important. Yet then you, as you know, having led Oaktree, it's also really hard to get funding for this work. So what does that say about how we underinvest in systems change, despite the often outsized, and we've just seen examples of this, returns on investment?
Yeah, huge question. Very difficult to get funding for this type of work. I've thought a lot about it actually for the last year, and I think I can sort of try to bring everything down to 3 key points of why I think it is difficult. So the first one of these points is really based on what you said at the start, Negaya, which was this outputs-based approach that we're all really obsessed with, right? Everyone's obsessed with KPIs, strategies, and fair enough as well. Like, we need to be accountable for the work we did, and as we heard from Shadow Minister McCormack, we need to be able to report that impact to the public. But there are things that we miss in that. And as an example, I was catching up with an old friend this morning, actually, that I knew from my very first gig in the sector, which was actually at World Vision, and that was through a youth ambassador program, a youth strategy that they had. And I was actually in the last cohort of youth ambassadors, because they decided not to continue that youth strategy. And of course, there were, I'm sure, different considerations that they were thinking about at the time. But what I was reflecting on with my friend this morning was that the impacts that happen downstream are rarely considered by donors, funders, and even organisations at the time these strategies and these let's say pitches out to donors are made. So, for example, while there were really short-term benefits to that program that I was engaged in, perhaps what they didn't count is that someone like me and many others would go on to continue working in the sector, continue to strive for impact in every facet of their life. And this is something that we've realised at Oaktree as well. We have lots of donors who are interested in funding our impact work, funding youth-run organisations in country, which we are totally supportive of, but less donors who are supportive of building our movement here in Australia. And what we've done, actually, I'm not sure if we have our Oaktree representatives in the room, but Ava, our business development manager, recently has just released a report on the impact Oaktree has had as a movement of young people here in Australia. And that has occurred over 20 years, the 20 years of existing as Oaktree. And just by the fact of having an output for young people to join and to be a part of something bigger than themselves, they've now gone on and dedicated their lives to numerous impacts that we never put in the strategic plan to begin with, right? So, for example, Penny Wong's Chief of Staff is ex-Oaktree, and Ali's Youth advisor is ex-Oaktree, many ex-Oaktree in the big 4 consultancy firms, probably a lot of ex-Oaktrees right here in this room. And so that's the type of impact that systems change of an entire generation who think differently because of a youth strategy that was funded at the start that we don't necessarily count. And I know a lot of organisations in this room have had to cut programs like that because it is difficult to report on. So that's the first observation that I've had, that outputs-based approach that requires those measurements, difficult to measure things to be reported straight away, that's not conducive to systemic change. And secondly, it's risk aversion. Of course, systems change comes with more risk. We cannot guarantee, like you said at the start, that we will build 20 schools or fund this many individuals. What we can promise is hopefully a change downstream that will impact many people, but that can't be confirmed and that can't be promised. And so it does take a level of risk and a level of courage, I think, from a donor to get on board a project like that. And then the final thing I thought I'd also mention is a need for further collaboration within organisations in the space. And I know quite a few of you will probably talk about this later on, but I think one of the things that donors find difficult is that your impact as a singular organisation is hard to measure when it comes to a systems change approach, right? Like, how can you really fully say that our advocacy contributed to X, Y, Z going forward when it is always going to be a team effort with lots of different organisations, governments, other stakeholders. And so I think we need to strip back our brands as different organisations and approach the problem from the endpoint. Like, what is that system that needs to shift? What is our unique place as a singular organisation contributing to a whole ecosystem? And as donors, how can they have faith in playing a small part in this bigger change?
I'm so pleased that World Vision invested in you all those years ago, because we're so lucky to have you, Thanu, and talk about a downstream impact. Amazing. Jane, a question for you. Thankfully, of course, there are donors around the world who are increasingly taking a systems lens. And of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were early movers in this space. They were thinking in this way some 20 years ago. But other organisations like the Asia Foundation are equally invested. What else is needed, do you think, in the funding space to really create that significant change that this moment demands?
Yeah, it's such an important question, Negaya. I think to really achieve generational change, we need long-term funding for feminist organisations, networks and movements so that they can organise for effective laws, policies and norm change. I think that's really essential. And that means cultivating efforts to democratise philanthropy and to build more cross-organisational partnerships for justice. And I think the Global Women's Funding Movement is a really great example of how to do this. Many women's funds have united around an issue such as gender and climate justice, and they've been able to dramatically increase the level of funding available to grassroots organisations to focus on systemic change to achieve the level of transformation required. And those funds include the 100 million US Equality Fund, the 150 million euro Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action. And also, really importantly, to the earlier points, it's based on trust-based philanthropy, knowing and recognising that communities closest to the issues are also best placed to know the solutions, and that level of trust in communities is really essential to seeing that level of systems change. And if we could see the equivalent of the US-based Tides Foundation in Australia, this is a foundation that funds progressive causes and movements, and they've provided 1.3 billion to date, it would make a really incredible difference. And Tides also works at a systems level for shared prosperity and social justice, founded on equality and human rights, on sustainable environment, healthy individuals and communities, and quality education. And its approach is one that crosses boundaries and links sectors and communities and cultures to also prioritise ideas that can scale. And one of the reasons it's been so successful is it's been able to mobilise from a rich and diverse ecosystem of donors. And so this ecosystem approach to philanthropic movement building is as important as the ecosystems for movement building themselves. And so I think building a progressive philanthropic movement in Australia with diverse, flexible and long-term funding for systemic change would be a game changer. And this would also ensure a people-led movement who are active advocates for systems change, and through this process also experience their own lives radically changed.
Beautiful, thank you so much. Anthea, I've got a question for you. I'll start with a quote. Our real problem is not a heating planet or rampant malnutrition. We only have one real problem, our own feelings of powerlessness to manifest the solutions right in front of us. When citizens are trained and equipped in transformational advocacy, not only are they pressing for those solutions that are right in front of us, they're also actively building healthy democracies. And going back to our mission and the threats facing our mission, healthy democracies are, of course, key to address all the other issues we care about. So, Anthea, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of citizen-led advocacy in really building healthy democracies, but also what that means in light of the shrinking space for civil society that we're seeing all around the world.
Thank you. Spent a lot of time thinking about this, and over the last couple of weeks spent a lot of time talking to colleagues. But before I do that, I want to also just acknowledge my shoes, because they are here for a reason. And a few people have asked me about them, if you can't probably see them, but we are talking systems change. Yesterday I had a pair of shoes that had a map of the world on them, and today I've got a pair of shoes that have a solar system on them. Because to actually think bigger and bolder, we actually have to go bigger and bolder. And so for me, it's a constant reminder of what do we need to be thinking about, who do we need to be activating and supporting? And this question really speaks to the citizen-led advocacy piece, because when we do have citizen-led advocacy, we see the ripples of that and the transformation that can happen. We see the power of transformative conversations. We saw that in the marriage equality debate in Australia and indeed in many places around the world. But as we heard on the panel yesterday that Helen chaired, we also heard that we have elements of regressive space in civil society where those conversations are dangerous to have in some places. I think it was Emily, though, that said, when you actually talk to civil society, maybe it's a thing we can talk a little bit more about, and finding ways to do that. So that conversation in that panel yesterday actually really resonated with me in terms of, one, they're coming for us, so let's all be ready, no matter what area we're working in, but also what is the role of civil society and citizen-led advocacy in that space. But we also see that when we've got longevity in our citizen-led advocacy, it can actually impact change. So again, going back to what we were saying before, a lot of these moments in time need the longevity and the agility around them. And I think of a campaign that actually many people here are probably very familiar with, and had many meetings in lounge rooms right across Australia in terms of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago. One of my colleagues at the time, and I don't know if Clancy is still with us, but obviously a lot of us are very familiar with that, and I had the privilege of actually holding on to that, that Nobel Prize at one point in time. But it does require that longevity and it does require that commitment, because the citizen-led advocacy is speaking the truth of their own experiences and bringing those stories and the ability to create those wider networks. I think for us as a sector, and some of the conversations we've been talking about as well, it does require us to be really conscious about what our role is in that. And sometimes we're very good at stepping back, sometimes we're not so good. And so it does mean that we're willing to take a bigger step back, but also know when we're asked to step in front, because sometimes it can be really dangerous. Human rights defenders right across the world are one of the most at-risk groups in terms of citizen-led advocacy. They literally are killed for the work that they're doing. So it also means that we've got to understand when we're engaging in conversations and advocacy in very restricted spaces, but we are supporting people who are wanting to stand up and have their voices heard. It's not for us to say no. We're not going to stand up and help and support those voices. But if they then want us to play a different role, we need to be ready and we need to be really agile to step into those spaces, step back from those spaces when we're not welcome. And so I think the final point on that is it does require multi-sector and multi-partnerships, and not just between us as the partners in our sector. We talk about system change, we also have to think of the ecosystem in which we're currently operating and what role are we playing or not really playing. And I think the presentation this morning, Dylan, was really also challenging. We're all consciously thinking about what is our role as international organisations, but maybe we're not even starting with the right sort of questions. Is our role literally just to be more supporting others to do this work? That's a really hard conversation for us to have. It's probably a really long one. I know at Oxfam we're starting to think about what is our role and how is that evolving as we're much more committed to systems change, but at the same time we are still supporting partners who are asking us to support particular activities, and are we shifting quickly enough to provide that support to them? So I think it's also around leveraging the collective power that we can actually bring to that space. And I use power in a conscious way. We often talk about power and privilege and shifting that power, but we also need to recognise that we do actually have a collective power. We need to be judicious about how we deploy that and how we use that, and respecting and responding to. But there is actually massive power that we can be yielding for the right reasons if we are invited into the right spaces to do so.
Thank you so much. And going back to that fabulous session this morning on decolonising aid, a question for you, Gershon. Given the moral imperative to decolonise aid and the shifts that necessitates, especially in the operating models of INGOs, what does that mean for social justice movements and advocacy organisations in the global north? Will there still be a role?
Will there still be a role? Absolutely. I mean, I think if I said no, nobody was packing up their shop and closing down their INGOs anyway. But yeah, I think Dylan's session was fantastic in the way it challenged us to rethink the way we do partnership and the way we see our role. I think there is some existential questions there that sometimes we need to ask. I think entering into responding to that question, can I just preface it with talking about rebalancing power structures created by colonial legacy feels like a bit of a sore point in Australia at the moment. The referendum was really bruising. And I think it's also illustrative too. The Uluru Statement of the Heart put forward at their core what they were asking for was structural reform, a systems change. It wasn't more resources, it wasn't our backyards, it wasn't more programs, it was systems change. Because I think that was an acknowledgement of that is what we need to generate the change. The resources and the programs will probably be needed later down the track. But the systems change came first for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because the system is broken as it so often is. I think in a lot of the work I've done with NGOs and talked to them, and even here at ACFID Conference, we often conceptualise the most important part of what we do is finding great ways to deliver great programs that often empower others to act or advocate overseas. And if we're working with local NGOs, we're doing the capacity building and the monitoring, but our job is to get the resources and the funding to give to them or to fund overseas to ensure that great outcomes are achieved. I would posit that knowing that the Global South are developing fantastic ways of developing their own programs, in light of the decolonising aid discussion we've had with Dylan, I'm not as convinced that is the primary place we add value. I do think we do add enormous value. The thing that we know best, the thing that we understand better, is our connection with our supporters. We know how to talk to them, we know their values, we know their language, to engage with them and take them on a journey. That and how our own political processes work and our engagement with decision makers. That is the bit that we add tons of value around. And often when we're talking about marketing, we're just thinking about how do we get funding through the door. But there's a bigger supported journey there for all of our people. You're winding me up. Yep. So let me finish on this point. I think the real power of what we have is leveraging our supporters and our engagement, the place that we know, to bring about the systems change that pushes us towards that sustainable development vision that we all believe in.
Beautiful,
Thanks,
thank you. You said I could shorten your spiel if I needed to. Thank you so much. I've got a question for you, Jane. There's a lead systems thinker in Australia, a woman called Professor Christy Muir. She's worked with a lot of for-purpose organisations around the country. She recently published an article in the Harvard Business Review where it talks about 3 levels of good governance. Level 1 boards honour their fiduciary duty. Level 2 boards, the next level, are also pretty good at tracking performance against mission. But she suggests the first 2 levels are not sufficient in imagining a new normal. She says the pandemic and social justice movements remind us non-profit boards need to lift their gaze and strive for systems impact, what she refers to as level 3 governance. Jane, I'd love to hear from you your thoughts on how we can shift, and organisations specifically can shift towards level 3 governance.
Yeah, thanks, Negaya. Well, I think a large number of NGOs, of course, combined with an increasingly competitive funding environment, has meant that boards have understandably focused heavily on revenue and risk reduction and financial sustainability. The competitive nature of funding means that NGOs are encouraged to increasingly differentiate themselves and, as you've said, to proclaim their unique value proposition, when really what's needed is a focus on our collective mission and our overwhelming similarities. So finding those points of commonality rather than difference. A systems lens recognises that no single organisation can address complex social problems alone. It encourages boards and leadership to look at their mission and ask, how can we work within a broader ecosystem to achieve it? It also importantly encourages an analysis of root causes. So, for example, what are the structural issues that are leading people in poverty and widening inequality, and then identifying the key levers that are necessary to effect change. And really importantly, a systems lens shifts the focus beyond organisational performance to the purpose for which an organisation exists. So this means really looking at more cross-organisational partnerships for justice that are intersectional, and that can be 5 or 10-year programs at least, designed for generational impact. So for instance, the work of Children's Ground, which is committed to ending extreme poverty and inequity within First Nations communities. So yes, I think Christy Muir's article is really important and timely, and I certainly recommend it to everyone in the room.
Beautiful, thank you so much. A final question before we go to a Q&A with the audience, and we're going to have to keep our responses pretty sharp if that's okay. But without investing heavily in systems change and policy influencing, we leave an enormous amount of power on the table. So what would a greater focus on all the issues we've been talking about in the last 2 days make possible for us realising our joint mission? Jane, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I'm conscious that First Nations leaders have called for a week of silence in light of the outcome of the referendum. And of course, we remain in solidarity with First Nations leaders at this time. So for this reason as well, I'll keep my remarks brief. But going back to your opening points, Negaya, and the scene setting that you provided, when the time is right, this is really an invitation to step into a new generational commitment to funding First Nation-led movements for justice. This isn't a time to stop, it's a time to step up and to mobilise and shift power, resources, voice, norms and policies to support the level of transformation needed. Many individuals and organisations and networks and coalitions have given funds over this last year, and many philanthropic organisations in the US and in other countries were inspired by that bold vision of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and would commit to a fund that supported First Nations leaders to take this organising and actions for justice to a new level, with solidarity and allyship from the broader NGO community. So this is really a time for a cross-organisational commitment to step into a new era of NGO and philanthropic organising for justice for First Nations peoples, and also for the broader health and well-being of the country. And for that level of systemic change needed, it's really vital to work together and to tap significant philanthropic funding from Australia and from other countries to make this possible. We know that people's movements for justice have led to the most transformative change we've seen in the world, whether it's been the anti-slavery movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement in the US, the independence movement in India, or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So when First Nations leaders determine the priorities they want to focus on, this will be the time for us to band together and to step into a new era of collective organising to exponentially mobilise funds and resources for systemic change and justice in this country.
Thank you so much. Gershon, over to you.
I'll pass the mic on.
Okay,
Absolutely.
beautiful. I might go over to Thenu and then I'll end with Anthea.
I'll also keep my remarks brief, but coming back to the theme of this conference, disruptive dynamics, I think we all need to really be prepared for what it means to be disruptive. And I don't think a lot of organisations are actually prepared to do what it takes to truly disrupt that system. That means, you know, not only looking at individual organisational revenue and impact models, but how can we as a whole sector make the impact that we're looking to make? Those are ways of thinking that we're not used to, I think, as individual organisations, but it does, I think, take that real disruption at the boardroom level, at the executive level, and filtering down throughout the organisation as well.
Fabulous. Over to you, Anthea.
I'll be very brief. I'll make 2 reflections. And one takes us back to, focusing on the mission and the reason why. And we heard yesterday from Sarah a very personal account. And one of the things that really stood out for me there is the mental and financial burden that our diaspora communities everywhere face. When our system is so broken that we know we can afford it, we have the wealth globally to fully fund our humanitarian operations, and yet we have a colleague with us who shared that very personal story. And so that's what happens. That's what happens when we change the system. We take away that mental and that financial burden to some degree. But we can also actually, and we heard earlier about the campaign for a safer world, so Thenu and I are very well branded at the moment, and really extending the invitation to everyone to join that campaign, because that is a sector-wide campaign. It is focusing on changing the systems. It is in our jurisdiction, it is targeted towards our government. It's what we know best in terms of understanding the political environment and the political processes that we can have influence over. And so that is one of our roles. Even though we're operating internationally, we are working here to change the system that our own government has in terms of their contribution to the global system.
Fabulous, thank you so much. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'd love to take some questions from the audience. We might take, I think we'll take 2 questions and then we'll work out who we put it to on the panel. Hopefully there's some roving mics, and we've got a hand up over here.
Thank you, everyone. What a great panel to conclude this great couple of days. And I have, I wish we could go out for dinner now and crack open a few bottles of red wine and get stuck into all of this. But Jane, picking up on what you said, I think we now have an invitation in the aid policy to move beyond rhetoric and look at Indigenous knowledges. And we had this beautiful breakout session from the Pacific with the weaving framework. And I think that, that's an invitation for the sector, for ANGOs to really embrace an alternative model, and that touches on what Sharon Burrows said yesterday about, we know the economic system, it's not broken, it works beautifully well for the people that designed it. So, we need to look at alternatives, and there's so much of that within this audience and within our partners. So how do we, as NGOs, move to the side and genuinely let some of that flourish?
Beautiful. I think we'll take one more question and then I'll work out who on the panel will respond. Thank you so much, Lisa. No questions. We've sorted out all the problems of the world. Over here, Nicole. Is there a microphone?
Yeah, just a question on the, joint. Often we're trying to push our own unique value propositions, which you mentioned. So what incentives exist for us as a sector to really have these joint outcomes? Like, what are our sector-wide KPIs?
Fantastic question. Thank you so much. Who wanted to take the first question about our role moving forward? I think was at the heart of your question. To move beyond the rhetoric. Thenu, as a director at ACFID, did you take that one on?
Perhaps, from wearing a lot of hats in the sector over the last couple of years in particular, one thing that I'm a big proponent of is that relinquishing of power. I mean, do we need to exist as a sector 10, 20 years' time in the way we do now? What is our role given the decolonisation work that we are doing? Is it just to funnel resources into local organisations going forward? Is it, just to be in solidarity with First Nations knowledge, local organisations? Those are the types of questions that I think if boards are not already asking, they should be asking. Because ultimately, as long as we hold on to power, then that power is not going to shift in the way that we've all been talking about over the last couple of days. So I think it does take a lot of that introspection.
Thank you so much. And the next question was really around, it was an important one around...
I can just quickly add, Negaya, I think there is a really important role, given the shrinking space for civil society in so many countries, and particularly in Asia, for the NGO community to be able to elevate the kind of leadership that exist within these countries under really challenging conditions, and to be able to support the connection with other networks and movements in other countries at a time of increasing oppression in many circumstances. The other thing, of course, is to be able to find other ways to fund these organisations when it's not possible to do so through traditional means because of restrictions on foreign funding, etc. So finding ways to be able to sustain and support these really incredible movements for justice, both through elevating their leadership, connecting them to other movements for solidarity, and figuring out other ways of financing and funding them to be able to hold ground when they can't gain ground. And so all of that is really critical. Having spent time in 7 countries over these last 7 weeks, I recognise that there is still a really critical role for NGOs to play. And if we can be better at working collectively rather than individually, I think that we'll certainly move the needle on some of the really important issues that we need to address.
Fantastic. And the second question, how can we create incentives so that we do better work together as a collective or an ecosystem? Gersh.
And what are we measuring to do that? I think, can I give a plug to the Safer World for All campaign as part of how we think through that? Like, we need a shared vision that goes some of the way in helping us to articulate these big systems change pieces that we can all work on together and work out what are the things that we actually want to shift in the short, medium and long term in terms of how we get there. And we know from experience that when we rally our supporters and our resources behind that, we achieve huge change. Like the last big grassroots mobilisation that Micah and Make Poverty History were a part of in the lead up to the 2007 election, Kevin Rudd was happy to acknowledge the reason that he was able to set a target that we never hit, but increase the aid target to 0.5% GNI was because of all these nagging profits, not just in his ear, but in the ears of parliamentarians around the country that gave him cover to do what he wanted to do. So we had a champion in Parliament that then had grassroots support to do it. Yes, when Abbott got in, we slashed aid significantly, but there was $16.5 billion extra raised in aid funding as a result of those advocacy efforts pushing on our aid program. I haven't done the maths recently, it's probably about 15 years of our collective investments in overseas development projects as NGOs. So it's a huge difference that we make when we think of our shared vision and shared targets aligned around a vision that we're all pushing for.
We've actually still got 5 minutes. If anyone has a final question,
I was going to jump in
comment?
on both questions actually, because I think they're really linked. I've often, and I'm a part of the reason probably. I'm a director of one of Australia's INGOs that is talking about being bold and changing systems, and then I know next week I'm going to go back into my system that I bash my head against, and all my colleagues do as well. So the incentive actually has to come from us. And I think that's what I heard from Dylan this morning as well. The action, the first action that we have to take is that we can actually collaborate. We know that when we've got a shared purpose, we collaborate really, really well. So we've got models of that even just within our sector, let alone when we talk about multi-sector engagement. So we can set those KPIs. We don't have to have them set by others for us. We can set them. And I don't even know if the word incentive is the right word at the moment in terms of the other message that we're hearing is we have to, because actually if we are ignoring the very communities and partners that we are hearing messages from, not just in the last couple of years, let's face it, many of us have been working for many decades where these messages have been told to us many times over, and we're not finding the right ways as a sector to shift ourselves. And so we can't really blame anyone else for that. Dylan, I think, referenced how we can try to blame others for that, but we haven't actually found a way to be bold enough and to actually accept that we're walking into a different space, that we have to be different because we want to be different, because ultimately we're understanding what the impact is that we're having at the moment is probably not the impact we think it is, or the anecdotes that we hear are not sufficient for mobilising the scale of that impact that we want. So I think we can, I think we have to, I think that's what we're kind of being forced and asked to do. And one of the, I think it was in the technology session, was sort of we underestimate what we can do in we overestimate what we can do in 12 months, we underestimate what will happen in 10 years, but we can actually flip that. We can sort of try and present and project that vision for 10 years. And what we can't do is just turn one word from 20 years ago into the next jargon in the next 5 years. So it was community-led development, then it was localisation, then it was locally led development, now it's decolonisation. We can't in 10 years' time have another isation word. We have to have something very, very different.
Beautiful. I just want to thank this incredible panel. I'll start by thanking Anthea for bringing all those threads of the conference together so beautifully, but particularly for talking about the important issue of the shrinking space for civil society around the world. It's such an important issue, so thank you for that. Thenu, thank you for all you've brought to the panel, in particular talking about the funding imperative for this incredibly important work. Gershon for giving that fabulous example at the end on the role of MICA in particular and what we've achieved historically and what we can achieve now with this incredible moment with Safer World for All if we come together and work really hard. And Jane, that wonderful concept around democratising philanthropy was fabulous, and it's a fabulous concept and love to keep that conversation going as well. So please join me in thanking our panellists for what's been a really important conversation.